Welcome to another episode of the Dark Horse Paranormal Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carr.
And I'm Kristen Johnson.
And this episode is the first in our series of ITC.
Instrumental Transcommunication.
That's right, baby. Instrumental Transcommunication. And we kicked it off with Connor J Randall of the Hellier series and...
also Spirits of the Stanley, which you can find on YouTube.
That's right. The Spirits of the Stanley is on YouTube and Hellier is on Amazon Prime. Mm-hmm. And I believe there are episodes on YouTube as well. We had a great time talking to Connor. He was the consummate guest. He was awesome and so well-spoken. And so much information is conveyed in this. This is really a lot of fun. If you're into ITC or you're a Hellier fan, you're really going to enjoy this. We broke the interview down. It's in two parts. The first part was our Bigfoot and the Bunny live show, which is on every Tuesday night on www.uprntalkradio.com at 9 p.m. Eastern and 8 p.m. Central.
And it's streamed live on YouTube by United Public Radio and on the air at 107.7 FM in New Orleans.
New Orleans, baby. That's
Nola.
Right. We do that every week, and we have guests on, and we present our own data, so do check that out. That's the first part of the interview, and then there's a post-interview that we did after Bigfoot and the Bunny. We get even a little deeper into the ITC. Mm-hmm. We had some quirks with this, and we have to be honest, we were very excited to have Connor on. We love Hellier. We're like big fans of that show.
And also Spirits of the Stanley.
And, of course, things went a little awry. So... we had this idea that maybe we should start scripting our intros to Bigfoot and the Bunny. So I started doing that, and what I did is made like a Word document, and I would put like my name and what I would say, and Kristen's name, what she would say.
Now, mind you, he gave me this 10 minutes before our show, and I'm like, what is this? So I'm reading it, and I'm like, no. I shouldn't. What does this mean? Why am I saying this? He's like, just go with it. Just go with it. I'm okay.
Kristen's passing the buck here, but I did make a big mistake, and I forgot to put my name in front of a particular line in this introduction, which is very short, but it was pretty awkward because it had been Mother's Day, and it ran like, you know, how was your Mother's Day, Kristen? And, you know, Kristen has children.
Of course, they say fine, and
it was great. So blah, blah, blah. And then my line was supposed to be, well, nobody calls me mother unless there's another word followed by it.
Now, of course, we can't swear on the radio. And what was that word?
It would have been motherfucker. And that was the implication, right? But unfortunately, I didn't put my line or my name in front of that line, and Kristen read it out loud.
And that's where the confusion came in with me.
So Connor had to be sitting there going, who the hell are these people? You know, and then it gets worse because, yeah. Kristen, you had some trouble with your internet.
I did.
We're connected, you know, through like the internet to do these interviews, and what happened?
Well, on Bigfoot and the Bunny, we're usually, you know, connected to Skype video, and on my laptop, the internet kept dropping. So I was like, oh my God, I'm on the radio with Connor, this, you know, huge guest. I'm like, oh my God, it just keeps dropping. I have to go back to the call. Wasn't happening. I'm like, okay, I'm going to use my phone. So I go to plug the headset into the phone, and my phone hit the table because I was so nervous.
Yeah, you dropped the phone. So if you're actually
watching, you can actually see this.
If you're watching the video, you would see the three of us talking, and then you'll just see Kristen fall on a table, which is kind of funny, right? That's how excited we were, because we really do love Hellier. We loved the synchronicity in the show, and like we feel like synchronicity is a big part of what we do.
Yes, it is.
We were related in so many ways. We kind of over-talked a lot. Kept presenting our own data to Connor, like, you know, he's our guest. And,
you know, what do you think about this? What do you think about that?
Do that? And we know that, you know, we're pretty professional in general, but we lost our shit a little bit with Connor, I think. Anyways, without further ado, sit back, relax,
and let's get this mother rolling.
Yes, sir. I understood, Doctor.
Mistake.
If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration.
Welcome to Bigfoot and the Bunny. We hope everybody had a great Mother's Day.
Oh, yeah. Did you enjoy your day, Kristen?
I did, thank you, but nobody calls me mother unless there's another word following it. But they don't have a day for that. Not yet, anyway.
The purge, maybe.
The purge.
We're trying something new with our intros, guys, and a little scripting. So if we sound a little bit awkward, that might be why. But yeah, go ahead, Chris.
In other news, we should have our Dark Horse Paranormal podcast, the D Word series, Volume 2, out at the end of the week.
The dreaded D Word. This one features Carl Johnson and James Anito, the folks behind Duo Demonology. We had a great time with them and also did an interview with them here on Bigfoot and the Bunny,
which you can find at United Public Radio Archives and also at bigfootandthebunny.com.
Excellent. Well, we have an amazing show tonight. Connor J Randall from the Hellier series and Spirits of the Stanley will be joining us.
We are so very psyched.
So, Connor, you're here.
Yeah. Hey, guys. Thank you for having me.
How you doing? It's a short intro. You don't have to wait too long.
Hey, I'm here for it. Get right to business.
Yeah, sure. We'll get right to it. The Hellier documentaries were about synchronicity, and we felt a certain synchronicity watching them.
Yes, we did. We started watching when season 2 was released, and we binge watched the whole thing in one night. It was so bad, but it was awesome.
Yeah, we stayed up all night watching it. We related to it immediately. The synchronicity. The Newkirks are a little like us. This couple likes creepy things and has a switchy occult kind of background. And I know at one point early into the series in the first season, I decided to post a picture of the Gremlin cryptid, on Instagram.
Yeah.
And like a minute later, somebody liked it that wasn't somebody we were following yet, and I clicked there because I go back and like everyone's pictures to that like game, and I go back and I clicked it, and I'm like, wow, who is this guy? It looks familiar, but he's got all this Hellier stuff, and I asked Chris, was this guy on the show?
I'm like, nobody looks so familiar.
And I swear, and this is a true story, like a minute later, Tyler Strand made his first show appearance. We're like, oh,
yeah. It was the same. There was no way. Oh, my God.
And he's I think just, you guys were promoting or something at that time, because I think season 2 had just come out, and I think you ended up liking the picture, but that was just really funny, and it was like, wow, we're having our own synchronicities going on, watching a show essentially about synchronicity, right?
Tyler Strand is pretty classic for interrupting everything, so that doesn't surprise me.
Connor, the show starts with a quote about synchronicity. What role do you feel synchronicity plays in the paranormal?
Well, it's funny. That wasn't. What's weird is that ended up being sort of a recurring theme throughout the series, and it's not something that I'm sure I had heard the word, but I didn't know anything about it. We didn't go there looking for it. We went there purely just because, we were looking for these creatures, and we were trying to find the person who saw the creatures. It's sort of a missing, man mystery combined with a paranormal mystery. And so we go there looking for this, and then suddenly we're just bombarded with all of these bizarre happenstance occurrences that just seemed like things were just slamming in front of our face. The kind of things, I understand that coincidences are often pegged as synchronicities as well. They are kind of synonymous terms, but a synchronicity is to the point where it feels directed to you based off of what you're doing. So, things like a book drops on the ground and a page opens and it's a picture of the thing that you're, something like that. And right. So I'm not sure exactly that I have any solid answers for what role it plays, but I will say that I think that what I've come to now just call the general phenomena may reach out and tap people and speak, quote unquote, to people through things like synchronicity.
Yeah, it's excellent. And I thought it was really a cool touch to the show, and started off that way, and you could see them build, and we've experienced our own, and we just thought, this is great, man. This is so cool. Can you tell us a little bit about how you started out at the Stanley and how you got your start?
Yeah, it's funny. I am lucky enough to have grown up kind of with the Stanley Hotel in my background and in my backyard, then it became a part of my background. I was 10 years old, my first trip to the Stanley Hotel, and I saw one of the locks on a door turn by itself and just completely sort of opened a lot of floodgates. And then other experiences started to occur. Of course, when I was a kid, a show called Ghost Hunters had just come out. I got really into that show. And then I started to sort of go up there with my friends on the weekends and pretend like we were the ghost hunters and go around with the video camera and do this and that. And it just sort of basically one thing led to another. I was lucky enough to live near and still live near this sort of paranormal mecca per se. And it was my first job. I was 17 years old. I just wanted to be around the ghost stories, so I got a job as a concierge out there, and one of the history tour guides. And so I just kept going back and over again. And then eventually, Carl Pfeiffer, Michelle Tate, Callie, Lisa. There was a few people who held this role of what's called the resident paranormal investigator, which basically the Stanley a few years back would hire a couple of us, and it would be our job 3 or 4 nights a week to tell people the ghost stories like a tour guide, but then also to try and see if we could have an experience with these people. And so I spent 3-4 nights a week for 3 years up at the Stanley Hotel, and had all these bizarre experiences, and sort of had the really unique opportunity to revisit the same location over and over and over again, which I feel very fortunate to have.
Absolutely. That is so cool. And I think you guys formed a team. I've seen videos under Spirit Investigations team, and then there's a series Spirits of the Stanley.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, we kind of like that's where the story of Hellier can't happen without Spirits of the Stanley. It's not nearly as big or as popular, but it is that's kind of where we got our chops, and everybody needs to start. So we learned. Carl took up videography. I started to learn more about audio, and we just sort of melded these worlds and created a little series, and people ended up liking it. Some people saw it. And then we basically had a lot of those chops going forward. And now we're just interested in telling cool stories with what we learned.
They're very cool stories. My goodness.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Tell our listeners about the Estes Method, please.
Yeah. So for those, I know this is out in way out in New Orleans, so far away from Colorado, the mountains of Colorado here, but Estes Park is the location of the Stanley Hotel. Many people probably know that or have visited as well. Estes Park, Colorado is where it is. It's also known as the Shining Hotel. It's the location that Stephen King was inspired to write The Shining about. What's interesting is that The Shining actually gives the Stanley a bit of a dark light that isn't necessarily a realistic depiction. We had overall very good experiences there, but it is absolutely haunted. And so we, at any rate, we sort of started to communicate with these spirits fairly regularly, to the point where, maybe once a month or so out of all of those nights, something really interesting would happen. And we wanted to get to know them better. So we tried all these different communication methods, the classic ones that you see on TV. And then we started to get a little bit frustrated with some of them because it's so easy to have what's called confirmation bias while investigating, where basically you will hear what you want to hear. And so we'll sit there and it's kind of like, how can we dilute this? How can we start to get rid of this? And especially when we're sitting there with a group of 5 or 10 strangers who are out, on their first paranormal investigation with us. And so what we started doing, I played drums, and I started to take all of my drummers' headphones, just these huge cans that block out, 20, 25 decibels of sound. And we would have these spirit communication devices, namely the spirit box, and we would just have one person listen to it instead of the whole room listening to it like everybody else does. And that one person would simply be repeating the words or the syllables or the sounds that they're hearing come across the box. And as they're doing this, we were pretty blown away pretty quickly with some of the responses that we were getting. And it was extra fascinating because there was no way that the person who was listening to the box could hear the questions or the conversation that was happening around them. And so we sort of made it even more hardcore, and we put the person in a big blindfold. And so the Estes method is basically a variation of listening to a spirit box in a very particular way. And there's sort of a very particular line of questioning like that we like to go through with it as well. But that's the gist of it.
Right. It's almost like a sensory deprivation. I wonder how this would be in a sensory deprivation tank if you could pump into, radio static and, how that would go. Kristen and I do a lot of spirit box work, and, apophenia is a very real thing. Pareidolia, you can absolutely start hearing what you want to hear,
right.
Or what's in your head, what you expect to hear, even.
Right.
I was going to say, you have to meditate like a little bit in order to get that sense of and listen to it, because like Chris said, we had tried it a little bit, and I swear, if really you cry, it's weird after you take the blindfold off your eyes, you're leaking.
Well, hypnotists would tell you that that's a standard sign of being in a trance-like state. So.
Right. That's what Chris was saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. We did an experiment with a couple of different essential oils, and I think it was clary sage, and I forget what was the other one. I'd gotten this from a book on witchcraft, believe it or not, by a guy named Peter Patton, who's passed on. But he talked about using these essential oils under your nostrils for left-right brain functioning, frankincense, and that it would open you up and put you in a trance-like state to do the witchcraft, right? The spells or whatever you're trying to work on. And we were experimenting. I don't want to say that we've done a lot with it, but we're dabbling with that.
I like it. I haven't heard of that.
We already have that in our background, but
basically
I picked up because I like this trance thing.
Exactly. Yes. It's funny that I like the line of thinking that you're going down. So basically what you want to do is, without changing the way the brain is working, right? A lot of people send me messages all the time like, you should take psychedelics, you should do this, you should do that. But I'm not sure that that's something that I would really trust. And so I'm like,
right.
well, what can I do to change the way that I perceive the world in order to enable the spirits to better and more easily come through to me? And that's sort of the name of the game at this point. And it's been a lot of fun. We've tried various variations of it, ways to try to disprove it, to prove it. One of the big questions that we have right now is distance. How far away can we have the receiver and the questioner? Does physical location matter in the spirit realm? And I don't really have the answer yet. But what we've been doing is things like having one person sitting in a room by themselves, simply repeating from the spirit box during the Estes method induced in there, and they're talking to a baby monitor, and everybody else is on the other side of the building. What kind of answers do we get there? And it's really kind of fun to try and tag down what the best method might be, because I really think it's very interesting. Spirit boxes alone, if you just take a spirit box, I'm not even really the biggest fan, but how can we change it? And now I'm completely blown away with some of the results that we're getting. So it's fun.
Right. And it's interesting when you say distance, fun. Chris and I we don't live together. So sometimes if we're not together, she'll call me, and we'll do a spirit box session in my house even, cool. With on speakerphone and that kind of stuff. And we see relevant answers go back and forth.
Amazing results with that.
So
we've actually
to make a difference.
Well, I'm sorry, Chris.
That's okay.
We actually did a session between someone in Florida, one of our friends in Florida. This is over Skype. Here in Massachusetts, where Chris and I live, and someone in Canada, and the results were amazing. They really were. It was crazy how our spirit box was picking up what her paranormal puck was, and the ovulus, and it was insane. So it was like a different country.
Getting on the puck, and we're like,
right.
Wow, this is great.
This is nuts.
Yeah, some sort of a line of communication. I'm not sure how those lines work yet, and I'm not sure we'll ever know the answer. But
I don't. I say that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, We like exploring, and we like the cutting edge factor. Is there anything else you like out there as far as like having favorite toys and stuff? Obviously, you're known for the Estes Method and Spirit Box work, but I've noticed in like the Stanley videos and stuff that you have out there that you've tried other things like REM pods, and there's different equipment going on. Do you have any other stuff you like, and why? Any stories that maybe relate to that gear?
Yeah. We one of the things we had in terms of like telling the story as shortly as I can without giving the whole tour. There's basically 3 spirits who we were most commonly communicating with at the Stanley, and that sounds like such a bizarre, solid statement to make. But given the fact that we were up there hundreds and hundreds of times, we really started to notice the same kind of people, these different cast of characters. It could have been the same ghost, just wearing different hats on different nights. That's totally possible. It could. I don't know how that would work, but basically, each of them kind of had different ways to communicate with us. Eddie was the ghost who became most well known to us through the Estes Method, and he has his own story. And then there was a ghost named Lucy. Lucy communicated mainly through audio. She loved to sing and had this very sort of lighthearted energy about her. Objects would commonly be moved around before interaction with her, things like that. I saw a flashlight leap up into the air once, a few inches. We had doors and windows slam and close on us. And it was always kind of a lighthearted, playful energy with her, though. And she communicated mainly through audio recorders. And then there was Paul. And Paul was more of the security guard who would only come by if something was going on that needed to be checked out. And that was mainly something like hearing disembodied footsteps, hearing keys jingle, somebody saying, hey, time to get out, things like that. That would be more of his go-to. But every ghost may have a different preference in terms of communication as possible, based off of my experiences there.
I had to laugh at that with the Eddie one because when we were watching Spirits of the Stanley, I love what he calls Carl.
Yeah.
Flower.
Yep.
Right.
That's great.
Yeah, we recently discovered that, knowing that you're coming on the show, we wanted to make sure we checked it out. And we went through those episodes and we were like, wow, this is great. So if you're a Hellier fan, if you've seen Hellier and you didn't know this is out there, you can catch it on YouTube if you look for Spirits of the Stanley.
Yeah, you can see the whole thing. You can see us sort of create this new method of communication. And it was a wonderful time. We filmed it over 6 months. And then after that, we left the hotel, and we were all bummed at the beginning, but then it ended up kind of being the way it was supposed to be, because now we're on to other stories and other things.
That was hard for us to watch because I was even crying at the end with you. So have you noticed a consistent difference in investigating with certain people versus other people? Chris and I call it chemistry, and we seem to do better working together as opposed to alone or with other people.
Yeah, that's a good question. Absolutely the case. Yes, I have noticed that. It's what we also, again, had the unique opportunity to do was we would be with a different group of 5 to 10 people every night. And so we sort of got a feel for the kind of individuals that spirits liked to communicate with. We had this joke where basically, and it usually ended up being true, people would be checking in to us to go on the paranormal investigation ride, sort of tour with us, and we would oftentimes have classically, stereotyping like a 40 to 50 something year old husband who is clearly dragged there against his will, who's sitting there with his arms crossed, not interested. And we could honestly usually look at that person and not say it to the group because it would just be a huge downer, but say to each other, Carl and I'd be like, well, nothing's going to happen tonight. And so that blockage of energy really seems to be a factor in a spirit's ability to come across. Now, you think about how much, I think it's sort of selfish to completely close everything off. I think that you consider how much energy it may take for them to come through to us. We don't know what they're dealing with on that side, in order to sort of relay some sort of communication. And so anything, even if it is just our sort of collective chemistry, like you said, or our excitement, is going to relay that to the group. Another thing that I noticed, even with nice people who are into it, is that if you're very quiet, they won't come hang out with you. It's so weird to me. If you imagine you walk into a room and there's 7 people sitting there in the dark in silence, you're not going to walk in and start talking to those people. You're going to be like, well, those people seem weird and insane. I'm going to go over here.
They suck.
And see where I'm going to go hang out where the party is. So we always try to keep a lively atmosphere as well, which sometimes I think is a dichotomy to a lot of people in their investigation styles.
Yeah, it's like the emotions, fear, if they're scared, if they're rowdy, like maybe that there's an energy in that they can use.
Right.
I know one of our other questions to you was going to be, and I think you just commented on it, was do you think that the spirits tune into you, or do we turn into them, or is there some kind of combination thereof, which is probably the case.
It's a pretty interesting question. I've sometimes I wake up in the morning and sometimes the answer is different on different days of the week, but I think that really sometimes I think that spirits are communicating through our minds, which sounds like a cop-out where you say, well, it's all in your head. But that doesn't mean that it's not real, that it's not communication that's occurring from their end within the synapses and the neurons firing of the brain. Who knows what they know, and who knows how they may be able to communicate with us like that. So that's possible. What's really nice is when you have something that's separate from you, that catches some sort of activity.
Right, like a recorder or a camera or something, that kind of data that you can collect. I agree. I think we're kind of limited by our own perceptions. We have these 5 senses, and they can only do what's within those. And you might hear something that to you, especially with like a headphone and a blindfold and that kind of stuff, really was clear. And we've had the experience of hearing things that weren't even on the recorder, and it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It did happen. It was paranormal. In fact, those are the freakier things, in my opinion.
It's true. It really is. What's funny is the other thing that, well, and that's another thing that I like to get to is I wish that more investigators knew more about their recorders. I think it's really important to think of things like, what is the frequency of this recorder? What sort of response does this recorder have? What can it pick up that I'm not hearing? I think people would be surprised to find out that probably 99% of the time their handheld recorders are absolutely within the human range of hearing. It's something that, in terms of the way sound works, that is there. You should be able to hear this voice. So when I hear a voice on a recorder that I didn't hear at the time, what does that mean? It means that either the voice is implanted into my mind or that the voice is implanted into the device itself.
Right. I think it's interesting that some people use, I forget the name for them, but they're basically recorders of bats, because bats talk on a frequency higher than human hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And then it more or less detunes it to something we can hear.
Right.
And I might try recording that way, because a lot of microphones actually have a broader range than the human ear does.
That's true. A lot of some of the higher end ones, I mean, even like the Zoom H1 comes to mind, for example, that can record a little bit higher than human range. The thing is you're never going to hear it in the room, but like you said, you have to go in and have fancy software in order to bring that down into levels. There's really not much experimentation going on in the field in that area right now, so it's interesting.
Right. Speakers are another big thing, I think, too. Speakers can tune, certain frequencies louder than others. If you have speakers that are made for listening to rap music, for example, and I'm old, so bear with me. It's going to have a lot of bass and drums, and it's more of those lower frequencies are pushed out in the sound spectrum. I always recommend people use like monitor type headsets too. Like the headsets you mentioned, actually, the Ludwig. I'm sorry, what was the brand?
Yeah, I use the Vic Firth ones, but
the Vic Firth. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
Yeah, I'm a bass player from another time.
Right.
that was my trade growing up, and when I was younger. And I dig it. You're part of a band as well, right? Yeah,
Rhythm Section Unite. I play with a band, a local Denver band called Ghoulies, kind of a punk garage rock outfit. We're actually old high school friends, and we're still playing, and we have a blast with it. We go on tour about every year or so for few weeks or a month, and just it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. I think it's cool. And as a musician, you understand those frequencies and kind of the effect of what a monitor headset is versus, a headset meant to kick up the bass.
Right. And I think a lot of people are going around. So that's part of the quest of this, right? And I'm glad that you're a part of it too. There's so many people going around not knowing their equipment very well. And it's not the exciting part of investigating, but all you need to do is just open up a physics textbook for 20 minutes and you can learn a whole lot more than most of the people who are in the field looking for these voices. So the more credibility, the better.
Absolutely. I listened to an interview with you, Connor, and you were talking about something, I think you called it echoing, and it's something we talk about. We call it parroting.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
It's something we've experienced
Yeah.
pretty often. And I was like, I told Chris about it. I was like, I listen to this podcast. They got to hear this. You want to tell our audience a little about that phenomenon?
Yeah, it's cool. It's interesting that you found it sort of independent from us as well. People who are looking for these voices frequently. We've noticed that oftentimes, and this is mainly with the Estes method for us, we would be talking, we would be saying something, and just talking about it in the room. Remember, whoever is actually in the Estes method, sort of in that trance-like state, they can't see or hear anything around them. But we would be having a conversation. For example, I would be sitting here talking about the red dog who ran down the hill. And then suddenly, unbeknownst to us, another voice responds back through the spirit box that says red dog. Well, what effect does what does that mean? I don't really know, but it's something that we noticed consistently enough that it became a marker of a pretty good session. They would say things in response to us very quickly, almost as if they were sort of bouncing back our words, which is interesting in two factors. Number one, because we don't know where the voice is coming from, but number two, that shows that they can hear us. And what does that mean? It also might be related to what they call, sort of having these gatekeepers, maybe they can't say too much, and whatever voice it is, in order to show its presence, is just saying whatever we're talking about in the room.
Right.
That's what we were saying too. We don't know why they do it, but
I like parroting.
You said, yeah, we call it parroting. That was our word for it.
Thank you. Do you think the spirits, entities, or even we'll say the D word, demons, can step into certain roles? Could that be what happened to Lucy?
It's possible, yeah. And people, not to necessarily spoil the ending of the series, but basically Lucy is an interesting case study. We were told when we started working at the Stanley that there was a spirit of a homeless woman in a particular building. We come to find out through sort of our research that there really wasn't any dedicated findings to reflect that there was ever a homeless woman who actually lived there, or who died near the property or around the property. And so, but yet Lucy is the spirit who would respond to that story. I think it's quite possible, maybe even probable, that it was just another spirit who was sort of agreeing to take on that role for us. I think there's two possibilities, though. I think that's the number one possibility, is that the spirit was taking on that role. I think the second possibility is that maybe there were so many, tens of thousands of people who took the Stanley Hotel tour, and there were enough tour guides who just, on the chance, mentioned Lucy and the story of this homeless woman. Maybe it's possible that they created the ghost, and in sort of a tulpa-like form. And so,
Interesting.
If that's the case, then I suppose that's a separate category altogether.
Right. That's
Right.
really
Yeah,
interesting.
this is how you look at it. But yeah, even in that, you're creating the ghost, or it's stepping into a role. It almost needs that point of transition to get through, or would want to. I've had that feeling on different residential investigations I used to do years ago. Like that something, like you get demon names back and you had an idea, well, this isn't really the demon, but maybe something that wants to be that,
Right.
Yeah, if you go through, I think if you take a house and you take enough people through it and you tell them this horrifying story, even if the story is not true, the energy of the story is still there, present within the place.
The thought, the
Right.
thought space. You put it out there, and it seems to arrive.
Create its own.
Yeah, exactly. It can take on a life of its own. In Spirits of the Stanley, there was mention of the number 440. And my immediate reaction was remembering in Hellier when Greg Newkirk played the keyboard melody. And I don't want to spoil anything for anyone when I say this, but I won't say what happened. But I was wondering if there's any thought given to tuning, because as a musician, I'm sure you know that a 440 is our standard tuning, but it's not what's considered the quote-unquote natural frequency, which is supposed to be 432 hertz.
Right.
Dr. Google will tell you all sorts of things about 432 and attribute it to the tuning of the Earth, the galaxy, and life as we know it. However, before standardization to 440 in 1926, many countries and organizations followed the French standard since the 1860s of 435, and 430 was also a big common tuning that was used widely, a little closer to 432.
I like that. That's good. That's good background research. That's something that I was aware of, honestly, just like you said, from a standard Googling of what does the number 440 mean. That is one of the open-ended questions that is sort of now put out into the wild to you guys, to everybody listening who's a paranormal investigator, to whoever's out there. What does this 440 mean? I can tell you that upon the initial creation of the Estes Method, when we were getting some of our very best stuff, that is a number that just completely independently, different people, different times would hear it over and over again. 440, check it, 440, 440. Maybe it's possible, like you said, that it was instructions to take the standard tuning back down to 432. I'm not sure how that relates to our world. I think maybe it's referencing playing more tones, like some of the old school EVP and ITC researchers would, playing that standard tone of 440 hertz. But that really is my best guess at this point.
I was going to ask you, is there a room in the Stanley that's 440?
That's a good question.
Is there a number room?
Yeah, it doesn't go that high. I think the highest is 428. So it's a good question.
Right. So you guys never really found an answer to that. And had you considered that tuning when Greg was doing I think you played on a keyboard, the melody in the cave?
I never did put, it's cool that you did. I never did put sort of that separate, that felt like a separate thing together. So the tuning within the cave was, I think it was just F major, which what is C, A, and F. So there is an A note in there. I don't know what that may relate to, but now you've piqued my curiosity there.
It's possible. Open another rabbit hole, right?
Yeah.
There you go. We have a rabbit hole. This is the reason why we asked, was because we actually have tunes as well, tones that come to us a lot, and they're the same tones each time, and it's just very weird. And it's very
send that stuff to you offline, but
that's why we wanted to ask.
Well, it's one of the synchronicities we were talking about when we watched your series. Like, oh my God, we got some of that too, and we just felt like we could really relate to it. Maybe music is a way that they reach out. I don't know.
It's possible. It's cool, and I really like, even from the most skeptical standpoint, you take a step back and you sort of wonder, what is this doing to this? Where's this voice coming from? I think that taking sound and giving it to them in their realm or wherever the other that they're communicating from, maybe that helps them sort of mold their voice around it. You sort of have to give them clay in order for them to mold their voice out of. Introduce some sound. Just like they did back in the day. I don't necessarily know if this is correct or true or not, but the Spiricom, highly controversial device that we used back in the 70s and 80s, it was 13 vocal tones, and they would play them all at once, and they would hear a voice in response. Whether or not Meek and O'Neill were being realistic, I think there's still a lesson to be learned there.
Absolutely. It reminds me, we did a show on applications last week. I was wondering what your thoughts were on those. Like some of those applications like Echovox, they use phonetics rather than the entire words. It might be half a word. It might just be ooh, ah, and got to try to put together things, which reminded me of the Spiritcom, right? George Meek and
Right.
William
And
William Bill O'Neill,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know,
Mueller.
and in a certain way of the way that it would put the words together, which, by the way, I think the Spiritcom was amazing and is underrated out there in a paranormal world.
A lot of people don't know about it, do they?
No.
Yeah, it's bizarre. It's so funny. You can watch his whole press conference where he revealed it on YouTube. It has like 5,000 views or something last time I checked. It's all there. It's cool. It's interesting. Yeah, I've gone back and forth on whether or not that I think the Spiritcom is real, but regardless, like I said, I think there's less to be learned. A lot of standard ITC devices that are making the rounds today are introducing tones, but they're also introducing, I guess to roundabout answer your question, I like phonetics because it reminds me of sort of spirit box induced things, which is obviously becoming sort of my world there. I don't oftentimes hear an entire word. When you're in the Estes method, you will just sort of spout out the syllables, the sort of syllabic drone that you're hearing. But people who are actually programming devices to say words, I'm a lot less trustworthy of, because if there's somebody behind this who can just as easily sit there within whatever programming language they're inputting into the ones and zeros, well, I think it's probably more likely that they're going to put more scary words in than not. So I just have to throw it all out.
True.
That's true, and I found that difference between different applications. We were talking about just that. I like the idea. I don't know if you need 20,000 banks of ooh ah ooh to put it together.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some beauty in the simplicity of the 13 tones. They were able to. I'm able to make out those recordings really well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's clearly, if that is legit, there's something talking through it.
Right.
And certainly the spooky word thing. I mean, I agree. I also think you should turn your phone in airplane mode so it doesn't know where you are and give you,
Right.
local data through words like Lizzie Borden is near us, for example. And, you would get words like axe and,
people are surprised at the capabilities of their smartphones, and they, I mean, it has a magnetometer in it. It has sort of the capability to things like that, and it has a pretty good recorder in a standard iPhone. I've used my iPhone to catch EVPs before. You don't need anything fancy. People are like ready to go out and buy these big toolkits when most of them have it in their pocket right now.
That actually brings me to my next question for you. That's perfect lead-in. What would you recommend to a budding paranormal researcher who's just starting out? What would you recommend that they read, buy, kind of stuff they should be looking at?
Yeah. I think that the very first thing somebody who is starting out with, and I wish that I could go back and sort of tell this to myself 10 years ago. I'm young. I'm happy to have, sort of a lot of this future in the field. But back when I was 16, 17 years old, it was just all ghosts. I was so involved, and that was just it. And I think that people compartmentalize themselves in this field. And I think that's a big bummer. I think that the cryptozoology crowd never talks to the ghost crowd, and they never talk to the UFO crowd, and they never talk to the alien abduction crowd. And in my mind, a lot of it is synonymous and works in conjunction with each other. And so I would encourage a lot of interest in all things weird. If you're going to get into this, even if you only care about ghosts, you should still read Passport to Magonia by Jacques Vallée, which is just a full-on encyclopedia of bizarre contactee and alien encounters, just to have that in your wheelhouse. I think you should read books. One of my favorite books when I was younger was a book called Legend Tripping by Jeff Belanger, who does work with the Ghost Adventures guys and stuff. It's so, because it was a fun, easy book that just said, hey, you don't need very much stuff. Just get out there. Being out in the field is better than not being out in the field and just sort of stocking up. Just get out there with what you have, use your phone, and use a notepad, mark down everything. The moon cycle, the barometer, the temperature, the day of the week, how you were feeling that day. And as you go through this, and as you notice maybe some nights something happens, but get in your mind now that most nights nothing will happen, but that's still a data point. Even standard no anomaly nights are still a data point on your graph, and it's still interesting. And so see what some of the patterns are in the local haunts and focus on an area first. And just sort of have fun with it. It's a lot of fun, and be legal and everything, but go out and explore.
Yeah, that's good advice. I think a lot of people do take things so seriously that they lose some of the fun element.
Right.
It's cool for like Chris and I to do it because we're a couple. We call this like a couple's journey. That's our thing, and it's our outlet, and we love it. It's fun to do together. We try to make it fun. I talk to people that you would think it. They were trying to get the law degree or something.
Well, even the name of your show is kind of funky. But yeah,
it is. It's catchy.
Yeah, there's a story behind that.
There's a story behind it.
It's actually a paranormal story too. When you consider the archetype of Pan and the Green Man on the Hellier series, what do you think is possible? The influence of collective consciousness on the paranormal.
Well, it's interesting. You look at, so I guess in terms of not giving away too many spoilers, in terms of the Hellier series, we started out in this investigation with my group of friends and I through an email that was about these creatures who were terrorizing this guy. They looked like little gray aliens based off of his description. He says they were coming out of caves, mine shaft on the back of his property. And it sort of ends up with this questioning of the larger trickster element in the paranormal. When I think of it, and I think if you have other people on the Hellier team talk to you, they'll all give you a different answer. Because I don't really necessarily subscribe or get into the sort of Wicca or magic side of it. For me, it's more about Pan is sort of the embodiment of that trickster energy, just in a sort of standardized name, a name that was used years and years ago in different cultures and different things like that. Pan, is sort of that archetype there. And so I don't, it gets to a point where you start to feel like something is sort of playing with you, which not necessarily isn't very fun. It's scary, and it's difficult, honestly, sometimes to watch one of my best friends, Greg, sort of go through this, where it feels like something is tugging on different strings in order to reveal itself through some sort of a project. That's a scary thought to have. I like to think of it more as like we are going around investigating this trickster energy in its modern day form in the Hellier series. So that's sort of my larger idea of it. The Green Man, I think, is a separate thing that's more relates to sort of the natural cycle of things.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's next for Hellier? Like, I don't know how much you can talk about, but we watched it. I know I don't want to spoil anything for anybody out there if you haven't seen it. I know it's on Prime, it's on YouTube, right? I think those are the outlets that have it. Funny.
There's this standard, I feel like, when people hear about Hellier and they haven't watched it themselves, I imagine it sounds incredibly confusing. And like, imagine how we feel. It's so weird, but basically it is a whole storyline that we literally, like I said, Carl and I learned some video and audio tricks and went out there to film Greg with our knowledge base of just being documentary filmmakers who are into the paranormal. And Greg has this bizarre encounter in his past, and we sort of said, can you rehash this story? And then said, well, let's go out there and try to figure out what's going on. And we did, and it was so fun, but also way bigger than we thought it was going to be. We really thought it was going to be about an hour long, and now Hellier is a 15-hour series on Amazon Prime. And so it's the case, if the phenomena wants the case to continue, the case, I think, will continue, and we'll continue telling the story. Right now, it's sort of a collection time, and that's what a lot of it is that we say that it's a completely crowdsourced investigation. I mean, you guys just gave me info about tones and things like that. Like, we hear things from people and just sort of put out the cards and say, here it is. okay, paranormal community, let's see what this big mystery is. And that's what's really kind of fun about it. So yeah, it's fun, and I won't necessarily say too much. I guess I should stop there.
Yeah.
Deeper down the rabbit hole. We'll take it down a
That's what I was
different
going to say. You guys, there's so many rabbit holes that just happens, and we understand that completely.
Yeah, it
We
actually
do.
kind of gave
And
us a certain amount of hope, for stuff we were working on, because it just seemed like this endless thing. It just kept getting deeper and deeper, and now we're
yeah,
researching
rabbit holes,
like this
ridiculous.
land, like 200 years ago, who was living here and that kind of stuff, and it just got really strange, and it seemed to point to more things. So it was inspiring and reassuring to see it actually.
Thank
Yes,
you.
very much
And
so.
I
You're
do
welcome.
love
Thank
that
you.
the crossover things like ufology and
Mhm.
certainly cryptozoology.
Yeah, we do a
With
whole
the
bunch of weird experiments.
paranormal, right? Because there's a certain standard for what's out there, and I think it was definitely groundbreaking to push
I
the limit.
agree. I think everything is all involved. They're all involved. It's basically all paranormal. Everything with UFOs and like you said, cryptids and investigating. It's just, I think it really is all involved together.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
One
that's like I was saying.
embodiment, basically.
Yeah, so that's why we just call it the phenomena. It's what sort of larger other term is there? I'm not sure, but and I got really good advice, and people who watch the series, I think, will see that there were some moments, especially towards the end, where I was really sort of mentally just like, what's going on? I don't, and it was, I wanted to leave some areas. I wanted to do this, and I wanted to look at this instead. And one night, it didn't necessarily, it's not in the cut, because it was just, we were just having a conversation. I was talking to John Tenney, who makes a couple of appearances in Hellier, and he told me something that really sort of struck a chord, I think, with what you guys were talking about too, where he's like, I think that you will end up being frustrated if you get in the paranormal to win. It's like it's a game that you can win. It's not a game that you can win. It's a game that you should play because you want to play. And that, I think, was really sage advice from him.
Absolutely.
That is pretty sage. I like that. Yeah, that's good. What do you do now? Like, you're not doing the series. Maybe I may or may not. I can't talk about that. But do you still investigate with Carl? Do you, Michelle Tate, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you guys get
We
together?
Greg New and Dana.
Yeah, we talk. I talk to the crew kind of every day. We are just in terms of being generally interested, and Planet Weird is sort of the larger blanket that the Newkirks have been working on for a while. And so we have a couple of other projects that are sort of in a bit of documentary format. There's one in particular that we're working on that involves one of their more haunted objects, and it feels good to have something that's different from Hellier, because Hellier feels like the sort of big kahuna, I guess. And so to explore other things, I think, is healthy. Even if it's not necessarily what the audience wants, I guess. But that's the kind of the beauty of it, is we just sort of made it ourselves. So we're sort of like doing whatever we want to do with it whenever we want to. But it's fun. It's fun.
I think when you get involved in something big like that, your thought space, it becomes filled with the particular investigation, and you draw those energies closer to you, right?
Yeah.
It becomes like a little bit obsessive, and it's very healthy to take a break from that and let me look into this now for a little while, just something completely different.
Right. Do you guys? This is just a question that I was hoping to ask you guys. I watched a couple of. Do you guys have particular spirits or a name or something that you are in communication with more than others, or is it just?
Yeah, we have a certain couple of spirits that seem to occupy a certain location out here. We call the undisclosed location, and I'll tell you about that offline, because they basically have discouraged paranormal investigating there. It's well known in central Massachusetts.
Okay.
But we've gotten the same people when we've gone back and gotten the same answers. We kind of went down the rabbit hole I just mentioned of becoming overly obsessed with it, where we didn't have to go there anymore. We could do it from home and get the same voices, and kind of plays into what you're talking about.
It's remote.
Yeah.
We can actually
thinking does. Thinking about it does. It got so bad that we actually felt pretty haunted, and we had to do exactly what I just mentioned and leave it alone
It's
for a
like
while.
more
And do
out
something
of
else.
sight, out of mind, and go do other things, and that's what we did. We started doing
Yeah.
Native
Yeah.
American hauntings
Hauntings.
here and things,
Yes.
and it was like you said, it was more healthier
Mhm.
for
Yeah.
us to do
It
that.
was the
It
true
was very
banish,
big,
if you will, was taking it out of our heads for a while.
Mm.
right?
Break from it. We
That's
purposely
interesting.
kind of let it sit, and we plan to go back to it, and I don't know, we're still trying to find those answers,
Oh
but
yeah.
you may
You
not
don't
win,
know
like you mentioned, there may not be a
exactly. We
winning
never find closure. We're just
rabbit hole.
investigating, see what we
Yep.
can come out with, and that's about it.
I mean, and it's but as long as you're enjoying doing it, and you're out there seeking some answers. I like your encouragement to people to. I think people are, and I don't want to be the one responsible for like people's homes being haunted, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that there's this big sort of anti thing in a lot of the paranormal community where people like won't investigate in their homes, where they won't do this, where they won't do that. But to me, I think practice is very important. I think you need to know your equipment, like we were saying. You need to practice what you're doing, and you need to sort of that's sort of like an NBA basketball player who only plays basketball when he's on the court in front of 20,000 people. Like you have to keep practicing where you are. And learn that way.
Especially in these times with COVID-19 and everything. I
Yeah.
a lot of people are finding their houses are haunted.
Yeah.
Right. A lot more time in
Yeah, a
them
lot
now.
of people staying home there. They were finding their houses are really haunted.
Spirits around them or something, I'm fairly convinced that there's a certain amount of spirits around people that you can communicate with, and then there are kind of location specific, not that they can't be talked to from somewhere else, but you might encounter them through the journey.
Yeah, and that's a difficult. I think that's a fair assessment, and that makes it difficult too when you're investigating with different groups of people, or when you're doing. So, how pointed do you want your directions to be? I don't really have the answer, but it's quite a quest.
Yeah, it can be quite a thing. Like on public investigations, like you ran those, you got a big group of people. Somebody could be haunted in that group, and then maybe that's what's talking to you that night.
Yeah.
The next night, it's something else completely different.
Yeah, train station sort of revolving door. Interesting.
Yeah, they can be tough with the noise. But where can people find you? We're coming to the close of Bigfoot and the Bunny. I do want to let people know Connor and I are going to continue our interview after Bigfoot and the Bunny, and to stay tuned to www.darkhorseparanormal.com or bigfootandthebunny.com to see what we end up doing with that interview and when we put it out in its entirety. But for now.
Yes, Connor. Yeah, where can we
People find
find you? Where can everybody find you?
Yeah, so I'm it's at Connor J Randall. That is on Twitter and Instagram. In addition, I have a public Facebook page, Connor J Randall Paranormal. Very easy to find, and really, like you said, on YouTube you can look up Spirits of the Stanley, but also we also like to drive people towards our big project that we've been working on for the last few years, which is Hellier, and that's on Amazon Prime. Hellier. It's the name of the small town in Kentucky where it's based. And that's on Amazon Prime. And then also, like I said, because we're in charge of it and we want people to watch it, we put it on YouTube as well. So while we would prefer you watch it on Prime, if you want to watch it on YouTube, it's there for you. So it's at Connor J Randall, and you can find me right there.
Wonderful. Thank you again for coming on and being with us and talking with us. We learned a lot. It was great. And Hellier is wonderful. Spirits of the Stanley is awesome. And we encourage everybody as well
Thank you, guys.
to watch. You're welcome. Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much.
We'll see you guys next Tuesday. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, guys. Have a great week.
Bye-bye.
Get ready for the second part of our interview with Connor J Randall,
as we take a deep dive into ITC experimentation. When you're on an investigation and you become, I don't want to say the word obsessed, but you get into it and you get into the history of it and the rabbit holes open up. What is it that, can break that cycle of of that obsession? I'm sorry, my cat just jumped up on the table.
Hi, cat. Hey.
Yeah, another one. You ruined my question.
That's all right. I'll take a question from the cat as well, if that's an option.
Bring your dog in. We want questions from the dogs.
They have a few things written down over here. I gotta
bring them in.
but they keep shredding it.
Okay. No. To sort of hit on the point that you were just talking about in terms of what pulls you out of an obsession, what pulls you out of, it's probably the case. Maybe people who are more psychologically intelligent than I am, in terms of that realm, or more into psychiatry. I think talking, like you said, changing your mindset, but also not being in an echo chamber all the time. I think that it's very easy. The paranormal, especially, is a difficult field to work with because it deals so closely with people's very personally held personal beliefs. And you're talking about their personal belief system in terms of, questions that are more fun, like, is there life on other planets? Are there other dimensions? To more serious questions, what happens to us after we die? And when you're searching for answers within that field, it's very easy for people to become incredibly hardlined with, this is what I heard, it's haunted by this person and this and this and this, but it's just not as black and white. So I think talking to a person who is a little bit more, you could even say on the skeptical side, like, talk to, like, you want to, quote unquote, a normal person, somebody who doesn't sit and read about this stuff all the time. Show them what you're doing. And frankly, in terms of doing paranormal documentary work, that's the harsh reality of it too, is we're trying to, we obviously have a niche audience, but we're trying to present something in a format that any Joe Schmo could watch it and be like, oh, okay, this is what's going on. That helps keep it in check as well. Having a video camera, having something there, also helps keep it in check without going too insane, because it's like, hey, this is still a story that we need to tell. And whether a camera is there or not, it's still a story that you need to tell to your neighbor, to your friends who aren't into this stuff. It's an interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool that, you guys explored this thing, and it started as one thing, and then a rabbit hole started to open up, and it becomes this other thing, this other untold story, which is very different than, say, going and even into the Stanley or, like a Lizzie Borden bed and breakfast, where you have this preconceived notion of what to expect, right?
Mm-hmm. That can be said for also paranormal experiments as well. The ideal paranormal experiment is actually having somebody who's incredibly blocked off and knows nothing about what's going on. Whenever, like, if you're doing something like the Estes Method, or like the Ganzfeld Method, or like remote viewing, you want to have somebody who literally doesn't know anything about what you're talking about. That gets as extreme sometimes as like leading somebody somewhere in a blindfold. So you have to trust your friends. But if you really want to go with it and you want to get objective results, that's the reality that you have to face.
Yeah, I think that's true. I know a lot of mediumistic people and remote viewers like to go in blind, as it were. They don't want to know anything about it. They want to, just feel the energy of it and take it from there.
Yeah, and I think even take it even from something like remote viewing too, from a different standpoint. It's even fun to do with your friends. It's probably something that you guys have tried, or something that's fun to do over distance. Like you said, you have a friend in Florida, have this, sit and stare at a picture, and be like, I'm staring at a picture of a mouse wearing a hat, and just tell your friend to sit down and meditate during the particular 10-minute time that you are staring at the picture, and then call them 10 minutes later and be like, what's going through your mind? And people might be impressed with the results.
When we were talking a little bit about the ITC, and I know you're preparing a lecture for ITC, where do you think it started?
What's funny is ITC, so it stands for Instrumental Transcommunication. Trans is a Latin prefix that means across, right? So it's communication from some place to another place. It's interesting, and it uses instruments. with some people, that instrument is a bowl of water. With some people, it's television that's set to a certain channel that's broken that shows images. With the majority of people, it's audio devices. And so that's sort of where my bread and butter is, I guess, in ITC is under, trying to learn more about sound and things like that. But really, the beginning of it started out way back in the 1940s, 50s. There was a man named Friedrich Jurgensen who was actually went out one day and tried to record birds at his family's summer cottage, and he caught these voices of his deceased mother saying his name. Completely shocked him. He got obsessed with it, fell into his own rabbit hole with ITC and EVP. Actually, I should correct myself. That would actually be AVP because it was recorded on an analog voice phenomena, not electronic. So, so back in the day, that was sort of the way that they were doing it. And then there was a guy who came across, who a lot of your listeners probably know as well, Konstantin Radava. Radava was somebody who used a myriad of different devices to communicate with the other side, but mainly electronic. Some sort of recording, some sort of cassette recording. And he would be handling these by oftentimes playing tones, like we were talking about a little bit ago, where we have tones where you give the spirits a voice that they can form of their own. And all of their examples are on YouTube. It's very interesting. There's also been evidence of the Catholic Church being involved in ITC and sort of EVP research as well. It's a huge question of what happens next, right? And so I'm frankly surprised that there's not more interest in seeing more and more of that. But I think that it's growing, absolutely.
Yeah, it's what we all want to know. What happens when we die, right? It's a driving force within a lot of our researchers. Absolutely. What happens next? What's the next deal?
Right.
Rhoda, didn't he invent a microphone?
Did, yeah. Radava was sort of it's like a crystal diode receiver. It's really cool. He published a book called Breakthrough in the early 1970s, and Breakthrough is a huge bulk book, but it's the first third of it is basically how he did it. It actually has schematics. I mean, this is not hidden knowledge. You can Google the book and look at it and read it and build the same device that he was using. And in addition, what he did was he had all sorts of tones that he was using that he would introduce as well, like we were saying. But Radava's work is cool because what he released in the entire back half of the book is transcripts, just straight transcripts of his conversations with spirits, which is so fun to read through. And he actually has some examples of people can YouTube it, see it very easily. Konstantin Radava's work in Breakthrough. And what I think is particularly interesting about some of the earlier work in EVP is that people would actually call out on particular spirits, which is different than what we do now, right? So when we walk into a haunted location, we sit down and we're like, let's see if there's any ghosts around. And we just sort of do a gigantic sort of collect call there. What they would do is he would sit down and he would say, all right, I'm going to talk to the ghost of Walt Whitman. And he would sit down and call on this spirit and see what responses came through. Some of his examples are pretty telling, but you could argue that that's a good way to do it, that it's a bad way to do it all day long. It's just a different way.
It also could be another spirit or entity being Walt Whitman. So,
Right. Like stepping into the roles, like we mentioned earlier.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do we really know?
I know.
And that's honestly some of the reason that he lost some of his credibility too. It's my understanding in the 70s, he was this German psychologist. He's a doctor, Dr. Konstantin Radava. He released this book and these recordings, and there were tabloids, and you can picture it right now. The same thing today. It's like crazed psychologist claims contact with Winston Churchill, But to him, it was a very real thing. And you read his examples, and it's a very earnest report of what happened, in my opinion.
Do you think ITC started with Tesla?
Yeah, Tesla was an individual as well who was interested in it. So was Thomas Edison trying to build a telephone to the dead. A
literal telephone. Yeah.
A literal telephone. so cool that it didn't seem incredibly far-fetched to him that this person who literally made a telephone, how paranormal would a telephone have seemed alone, back then? But then to sit down and also be like, all right, let's talk to everybody else now too. And he was into it, and it's cool. I'm all about that interest in these devices. And people do ITC all the time when they go ghost hunting. I just don't think they necessarily realize it. They don't have necessarily a set way of going about it. I think more people could have more structure in their investigations, but in general, it's cool to look back at the historical examples, be like, yeah, they were into it.
Yeah. He thought he heard aliens, which he was doing the first crossover, right?
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah,
way. Yeah,
that's true. Hey, people who try to talk to ghosts, they end up talking what they believe to aliens all the time, and vice versa. And it's Frank. Yeah, Frank Sumption, right? Created the Frank's box.
Yep.
He was talking to the sky beings, talking to this. He didn't claim to be talking to ghosts, and yet it ends up on Ghost Adventures as this ghost communication device.
right. Defined as such.
Right.
Defined as such.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. And that's one of the things I really loved about Hellier, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is that you guys do cross those boundaries, between the cryptozoology and ufology, and certainly, ghost hunting. And I don't like that term, ghost hunting. But,
Yeah.
yeah, paranormal researcher. I like that better than anything, really.
It's a gentler term, that's for sure. Yeah, it's a bizarre world out there, and we have a running joke, and it's funny because I ship out, when people want to support the project, I ship out like the merchandise for people, and our top selling T-shirt for Hellier is a T-shirt that says 1 star, no goblins, which is literally an Amazon review that we received. It's a very polarized,
Really?
yeah, it's a very polarizing show, and it's just sort of like become an inside joke that people who watch it, are like, it starts out the very first 15 minutes as a show about goblins, and then it just boom turns into something else. And there's a lot of people in the review section and then in the YouTube comment section who are extremely upset that they didn't see any goblins.
I
What
believe
they
Well,
were
it's because of the
expecting.
rabbit hole.
It's a jaded
and
audience
things.
out there,
I know.
I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I was really intrigued when Greg went under and he went under hypnosis, and you could actually feel yourself, being the viewer, how he was feeling. He was saying he was being pulled up, like he was having not UFO, but alien pulling him up into the sky, and you could see the look on his face. He was really scared.
It's like an abduction.
And he had to come out of it. Right, abduction. He was being abducted.
Yeah, it's a really good yeah, it's scary, and people seem to get upset about those scenes as well too, but it's like, guys, we all signed up for this. Like, we're ready to experiment and see what's going on.
Right.
But the general idea behind that, which I just really, the more I think about it, the more I think Greg really is onto a brilliant streak here, potentially, where he sort of had this idea that maybe alien abductions don't necessarily occur physically, in terms of your window opens and a beam, takes you through your window and up into a spaceship. But in reality, they occur within your mind. And that doesn't make it not real. But it's possible that they just have the ability to flick a switch for an experience. It's possible they're physically abducting people too sometimes, or maybe it's some sort of a combination of both. But his thought process, where he was thinking about that, and then he thought, well, it's pretty common that people have what they call hypnotic regression with alien abduction, right? So people will sit down, they have missing time, they don't know what's going on, and then they sort of revisit back and they say, well, bring them back into the moment, and that event has reoccurred. That's most famously with the Betty and Barney Hill abduction up in New Hampshire, up by you guys, right? So the thing is, what's the opposite of that? And his question was, well, is it possible to induce an abduction into somebody, right? To get a hypnotist to make somebody think that they're being abducted by aliens. And what happens when you do that? Well, he's tried it a couple of times, and they're both in Hellier. One to one of his friends, and one to Carl, the cameraman, my best friend Carl there. And both times were very interesting. There's a couple possibilities. I think the viewer kind of brings their own conclusions about what occurred, but it's a cool experiment.
It is.
It really was.
It gets into that idea of trance states that we were talking about earlier.
Mhm.
You know, and what is a trance? And then people talk about sleeping and sleep paralysis and old hag syndrome and things of that nature, which I personally experienced. Chris has had sleep paralysis before. I actually saw the hag before I knew there was an old hag syndrome.
Oh, did you?
Which is a pretty interesting thing, right? Like,
It's not to see.
where does that archetype come from? It's
Yep.
apparently lived for centuries in different cultures, but I saw it, you know, and I remember talking about it. This is years ago, and I didn't know about it, at least not consciously. I mean, it's possible I unconsciously read it somewhere or saw something, but there it is, you know, and it comes back. What is that? And that's, I think, the source of a lot of alien abductions could be maybe in those sleep paralysis states, or you know, going into remote viewing and astral projection.
It's so, yeah, sleep paralysis is pretty cool. It's a moment where like your frontal lobe is awake, but the rest of your mind and your body is not. So you're still locked down. It's scary. I've had it happen once. It sounds like both of you guys had too. And people will typically have it maybe once or twice in their life, not often. It's also more common when you're not sleeping comfortably. So it's actually more common that you may experience it in a hotel, for example, which is why a lot of people think that maybe hotels are haunted when they're not, or vice versa.
Good point. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but the other thing is like, well, what's going on with sleep paralysis? It's possible. It's a double-edged sword, right? So it's possible it explains away some stuff. It's just a psychological phenomenon. Or it's possible that that's a moment in time where your mind is open and receptive.
Right. I personally think it's becoming aware that you're sleeping, you know, and it has something to do with that. And sometimes you don't immediately gain control of your body. You know, if you've ever had the lucid dreams, you know,
Yeah.
anything you think of, you know, very similar to astral projection, you can create in those dreams, and it just happens, you know, and you remember them in a vivid way. I've found a tie-in to my own personal experience with the sleep paralysis with the lucid dreams. And I did have that one experience where there was this kind of crone-like figure chasing me out of the thing, and I felt like I was drowning and couldn't move. And,
Was
you know,
the,
very weird that archetype is carried over through different cultures. And
Was the hag in your room, or was it like on top of your chest?
She wasn't on top of my chest, as I guess it's typically described. In fact, I had more this idea of going through like a tunnel of water and not being able to breathe and being chased by it. Like I saw her, knew that impending death, if you will, quote unquote, was about to happen. You know, and I'm trying to wake up, trying to gain, because I had been having a lucid dream.
Yeah.
I was flying, I was doing this thing. It was sort of like E.T., if you will, with the bicycle, and they're kind of like riding, right? I didn't have the extraterrestrial, but I was definitely flying, and I was flying at about that height, and like enjoying the hell out of this dream. And then suddenly this kind of like vision of a crone came into it, and it was like she chased me out, if you will.
Okay. Well, that's unsettling.
Yeah, well, it was really unsettling. It's about 8 years ago, but I wasn't familiar with the old hag syndrome, and I became familiar with it recently. And Chris and I have been talking about it. We might do a show on that.
I think we're going to do a show on it. I've never seen her. We probably will edit this out, but I've never seen her. But when I did have them, I never sleep with my arms behind me, and my arms were literally behind me, and somebody was pulling on them. And I couldn't move, and I was screaming, someone to help me.
Paralyzed, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, my daughter has that experience a lot. I have a 20-year-old daughter, and she has issues with it, but she's never seen the hag either. So
well, that's good.
Yeah,
I guess.
I didn't take you out of the ITC conversation, but I was thinking about you know, the hypnosis and stuff with everybody, and it's just I need to go into hypnosis to figure out. I've blocked everything out of my mind since I was a child, so that's why I choose not to see.
Yeah.
Trance states.
But yeah.
Trance states are a thing.
Might be a thing. You know, this thing with the essential oils I mentioned earlier, with the claret sage and the frankincense, is kind of interesting because, according to the author, Peter Patton, it is opening up left and right brain functionality and kind of separating it more so than it already is. And it's supposed to help you go into a trance. And it is an interesting effect because, you know, while one nostril kind of smells both scents, they're different. They're predominant in each nostril. So
that's cool. And that's part of our ongoing experiments too. And it sounds like it's like, what can we do to induce a different state of mind? And you know, getting back to the hypnosis thing too, we don't really, of course, one of the options that Alan Greenfield talks about in the series that had dawned on us was, what if he did have an experience, you know, at some point in his life, and that was just blockaded somewhere deep down in his mind, and we just accidentally brought that back to light. I mean, that's a possibility as well. It was particularly interesting, that one particular abduction sequence with Jason, because what he were experiencing were not the typical grays. They weren't any sort of Hollywood type alien. You know, they were a little more amorphous, kind of octopus-like, which makes it even weirder that his mind would, you know, quote unquote, make up such a thing.
That's creepy.
Mm-hmm.
I know Dana wears the God helmet. That thing seems insane to me because she said it takes her like 10 days to recover from one session.
Mm-hmm.
And that's scary. She's like the third day, she really feels bad, you know, feels awful.
Hey, kudos. Dana's possibly the gutsiest member of the group. And she's also the most reserved, you know, just kind of a weird combo. Yeah, the God helmet, or the Corin helmet, if people want to Google it, it's more also commonly referred to as the Corin helmet, Koren. The Corin helmet is actually something that was developed by, I believe his name was Michael Corin, or Stanley Corin and Michael Persinger, I think. They were two doctors up in Ontario, I believe, up in Canada, and they basically tried to create a helmet that could induce a sort of quote unquote psychedelic or other experience within the brain by basically firing onto certain sections of the brain. I will say, in terms of a disclaimer that I think it's important that everybody knows, is that there are people out there are TV shows, I won't name any names, who claim to be having God helmet stuff, and it's not. People are just like strapping magnets to their brain, and it's probably doing something incredibly dangerous. So don't go out
healthy.
Yeah, don't go out and do that. But basically they were in contact for a while with the guy who actually helped create it, and he sort of gave them an abridged version of their experimental device. And weird stuff. But again, what's going on with consciousness? That's their question.
Does it work through like EMF pulses, or how does it interact with the brain?
It's my understanding that basically they have all of these different nodes that are in particular sections fitted to the individual. And those nodes are similar to old like telephone receivers that were on the bottom of the telephone back in the day.
Wow.
And so they have these sort of magnetic impulses, but it's not necessarily a magnet in a common sense. And the impulses will fire in a pattern that helps to sort of activate a certain portion of the brain at a certain portion of time, because you have to have two things. You have to have the helmet, and you have to have the program that it connects to that actually does the correct sequence in the right order. And I'm not smart enough within that realm to know what it's doing, but that's my understanding of the basic, is like inducing sort of an experience into the person.
That's really interesting. It isn't something that's available at, you know, ghosthunters.com or whatever it is.
Right. They had to
go out of your way to get that.
Yeah, that was like their rainy day fund for a couple of years. So I don't know. Maybe they'll do an exhibition and let people try it sometimes, but I don't know. It's possible to get one, I think.
Are there any other cutting edge experiments that you guys have been up to, like other things that, you know, aren't of the norm, the normal set of tools?
Yeah, we're doing a little bit more involvement in meditation and things in terms of not necessarily remote viewing practice, but going into under hypnosis. And actually the hypnotist, his name's Lonnie Scott. He's a pretty nice guy. He actually sort of gave us what he calls keys that enable us supposedly to enter into that state a little bit more easily, where we think of a certain object or we think of a certain, and we sort of relax and head into that headspace. And so we're trying to sort of communicate a little bit more in that realm, but it's entirely sort of substantial, I guess. You know, the question of what are we gaining objectively? My work is sitting more in like audio, like tones and frequencies, which was hinted at a little bit. And we talked about it again on the show a second ago, but we are trying to do a little bit more with that. One of the things that I'm trying right now is actually getting an FM frequency transmitter and actually creating my own little mini radio station that just has a tiny little 200-foot range and is broadcasting a spirit box feed across that station. And so will that increase the susceptibility of the spirit box is the idea there.
That's interesting because you're putting out the amplitude.
Cool.
Maybe I can use the amplitude to actually give you back the answers you're looking for.
Yeah.
Rather than something that's already pre-produced by someone else.
Right.
Yeah. I like that. I like the REM pods. I think the REM technology, although simple, is pretty cool when it works. It is a pretty awesome and startling thing.
Yeah, it really is. REM pods they're so focused around their little antenna, and it's something that's available, you know, on websites that people can get. It's a device that I would be more likely to trust than something like an Ovilus or something like one of the apps like we were talking about. It's
right.
Objectively there. REM pods can be set off by walkie-talkies, so fair warning to your listeners that don't bring walkie-talkies.
Yes, they can. That's
so
right.
You don't really trust the Ovilus too much, or?
Depends. I think if I used to sit down with it in the Stanley, and that's just personally my experiences. I was never wowed by Ovilus responses. But I also never really interacted much with it. And so maybe it's because I didn't have a correlation with the object itself, you know, because I was so into my own little world. But yeah.
On episode 2, Spirits of the Stanley, I laughed my head off because when you had Murder by and when you were sitting there, the noise was to your right, and the Ovilus, I swear, goes, uh-oh, and I had said it just before that, and I was laughing my head off. It sounded just like that to us. It went, uh-oh, after the noise.
Yeah.
Right. It's something that
it was great. It was like...
That was so scary. Fun.
Something really goes foul in the world.
We enjoyed watching that.
It's like a running joke between us, and we saw that, and we're like,
uh-oh, I got to listen back. That's awesome. Hey, Eddie, Carl thinks that Eddie used to talk through the Ovilus sometimes too, and I think it's quite possible that he did. Man, it's so weird that I wonder how much they have to focus their energy on particular things. And I would just always sort of call it to like, let's do voices through Spirit Box. Let's do voices through Estes. Let's do voices.
But that's a comfort level, right? Because you're used to hearing it.
Yeah.
It seems to me that Spirit can use anything. If it really wants to, it can really, you know, people use divining rods and to flip coins, you know, it can be as simple as that, or it could be an application. I mean, I've heard applications as prone to, you know, discrediting it itself as they are. I've heard them work in ways that, you know, oh, wait a minute, no, that thing's working. The thing I hate about the applications is that it's a steady flow, you know. I wish it was like an external trigger, even if it was something as simple as EMF or REM or something that launched it into its vocabulary banks rather than it just constantly spitting out, you know, phonetics.
Right.
It depends on the person as well, because I have an app that I use sometimes, and it's SGK1 Ghost Spotting app. And literally, I took it somewhere to one of our places, and as I was holding it, we were at a mausoleum, and I asked, who's buried here? Yeah, we really were. And it's part of our rabbit hole. And I said, "Who's buried here?" And it comes back, Chris Carr. And that literally
My
said
name.
that on
That's
my
you.
right on
Yeah.
the app.
Right.
Yes.
It's like, where did it get that from? You know, is it reading
So
your
I'm
documents? How did it? It's clearly
Mhm.
did say my name, which is
because we
creepy.
debunk things.
Yeah.
You know, we got to debunk this stuff. So I'm like, is it
Exactly.
reading my text? Is it reading my contacts? What is it doing? Did it really
That's
say that? That you know?
We recorded
that's
it.
But I
almost a
do
little
believe
freaky.
Yeah,
it
was
is. It was
you know,
sticky, but we
some
laugh
of these
about
things
it
are,
now.
and
So
that is
I
the
think
lure
the
of all
person
this. That
holding
freaky stuff.
it or with their energy, and they connect with the spirit's energy, and yeah, because they need energy to do the things that they do and say the things. So
Hmm.
You bring up a good
yeah.
point, though. You mentioned debunking, and I really think that people need to debunk their work before they present it to people. I think it makes us all look bad if you don't try to go through the basic steps. You know, I co-wrote a book on debunking uh,
Yeah.
with someone, and you know, I want to debunk. I don't like reflections. I don't like things that you can figure out. Apophenia I mentioned earlier. You know, you need to bounce these things off of other people and see what they think it sounds like, that maybe have a clear head and that kind of stuff, because you can become so obsessed that everything sounds like, you know, the devil you're following, you know, or
Right.
chasing or whatever.
And after a while, you experience pareidolia. So you got to take.
Exactly.
Hmm. There's another thing that's fun to Google for those out there who are interested in those topics, like things like the what's called the cocktail party effect, right? Your mind, even if you're sitting in a noisy room, your mind will sort of, even if it only hears every third word of a sentence, it will create the whole sentence, you know? So yeah, it's pareidolia. You
Those
can
are-
hear what you
those are the
want to
blanks,
hear.
right?
Yeah,
Like
it
seeing
does.
faces. They say seeing faces, like in clouds or whatever it is, goes back to some, you know, primitive times of humans who needed to see faces of other tribes and other
That's cool.
cultures and stuff, and would try to form faces to know what they were going to do. You know, it was
Yeah.
an essential survival mechanism, and that's why it's ingrained in our brains, supposedly.
That's interesting. I
Some
like
science
one
points
thing,
up.
I can't remember where I heard it, but apparently along those same lines, something, you know, when you're sometimes falling asleep and and you feel like you suddenly drop a little bit and it freaks you out and it wakes you up. They say, I heard at one point that it's possible that goes all the way back to the early versions of man sleeping in trees and falling out of trees. And
Wow,
so,
So interesting.
that's really cool. I haven't
yeah,
heard that.
yeah,
Makes sense, though. You know, it
kind of
probably
does.
did, considering the other creatures that were around us.
Hmm. Hmm. So we have a whole lot of we have a whole lot of information in our brain that we're not necessarily accessing most of the time. So how do we relate that to the paranormal, you know? And that's part of the ongoing quest of ITC, of other things like that, you know, experiments and hypnosis. But the mind is a very interesting thing.
It is, and like one person's experience, you know, can vary to another's. Um, I don't know. I feel like when you have a true unexplainable experience, though, it is kind of like it shifts you a little bit. Like, wait a minute, there's nothing in my world that explains what just happened. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
And it changes you.
It really does. You kind of get the bug. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity at the Stanley to watch people have a first paranormal experience sometimes, occasionally. You know, when we talk about it in retrospect, obviously you remember the way memory works is you remember a lot of the good times and you sort of forget about the nights where you were there for 12 hours and everybody was, you know, nothing happened and you were just sitting around. Over and over and over again. But when something did happen, 1 out of 15 investigations that just blew it, it would keep you coming back for the rest, you know? Talking about people who have their first experiences, that is particularly interesting because they're completely independent from it. So when I had a story of a guy who was there at the Stanley at a business trip, and apparently, whether it's possible, I don't know, claimed that not knowing that the Stanley was haunted, and saw an apparition of a girl upon walking out of the shower and stepping out into the main room of his hotel room. Saw the apparition of a girl there. So it's like, is that something that's completely independent? Is that a corporeal form that's boom right there in the room? Like, is that the holy grail of that sighting, that guy just happened upon? Because his mind certainly wasn't thinking about it, which makes it even more interesting. And that's why investigations, it's fun, and you guys probably do this too. You just kind of chat sometimes. Don't laser focus all the time. Because the ghosts, you want them to hang out with you. You want to have an interesting conversation.
We often investigate in the day. Do you see any difference between day and night, and why, maybe?
I see, I think that they're, in my opinion, you ask everybody who's in this field, I think they'll have a slightly different answer. In my opinion, I notice a little bit more at night. Most people will be like, well, that's because the night is quieter. That's because, et cetera, et cetera. I might even take it a step further and say that, it's quieter. If spirits are made of like UV light, people say, then the sunlight is washing them out the rest of the time and they're more apparent in the darkness. In addition, another idea that I am interested in is maybe there's so many people who are in a dream-like state within that regional area at the time. Maybe it provides whatever sort of juice is needed to come through. That's a possibility, especially in regards to investigating a haunted hotel or something along those lines. But in regards to patterns, what I actually noticed, and I can only talk from my own experience with the Stanley Hotel, I tried to keep track of when I noticed more activity than others. I actually noticed more activity in the wintertime than the summertime. February especially, I remember being, one of my favorite months.
It's an odd observation. That goes back to your detailing, the moon cycles and, the day and that kind of stuff. And I'm able to look back at it years later. It's a wonderful opportunity to be, a guide in the Stanley, to have that openness and then do the public guides and tours and then be able to go back with your group of guys and, do your thing.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome,
Yeah, it was a blast. Have you guys ever been to the Stanley?
No.
Well, thanks to the COVID, we were going out there. We were going to do. Where were we going, Chris?
Still, we're talking about doing it in October. We have a friend out in Colorado, and she's going to take us out there, and she hosts a different hotel. Actually, she's a guy. What do you remember the hotel name? I forget. I see it pop up in paranormal things here. I forget, but I'll have her. Her name is Clarissa Vasquez.
Okay.
She's from Colorado.
Cool.
And she does Colorado Coalition of Paranormal Investigators. She's had that together for years and years.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
That's cool. That's funny.
We're going to go there, and then we were going to have a what was it? Was it a Paracon we were going to?
Yeah, there's some sort of paranormal event, but we don't know if
set
it's
up
on the table where things are
at.
at.
We were going to go visit the Stanley after that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's what you would have to do, honestly, if you're at the blast, even just to see.
Have they actually grown a hedge maze out there? I think.
Yeah, they are.
That recently. And,
they do have a hedge maze. It's pretty short, but it's it's 4 or 5 feet tall now. So it's kind of lame, but it's fun.
That's a cool idea. I'm glad they're doing that.
Yeah. Go with the
movie. I love the movie, even though it was different than the book with the animals, but it was definitely part of my childhood reading that. And
that whole correlation. Read just the intro of the book before you come back out, and you'll see the description is very clearly set at the Stanley, and it's cool to walk around with that in your mind. But yeah, Colorado's a good place. It's funny. I feel so isolated being out here oftentimes in terms of other big places. There's a lot on the West Coast. There's a lot. Everything's old where you guys are at on the East Coast. There's a whole bunch of haunted tales. Whether that matters or not, I'm not sure. But it's cool to have a location, and all of the conferences, all of the everything's just being canceled right now, understandably, rightfully so. But man, it's interesting to see what happens to the field after this year.
Yeah, it's going to be strange. Like as I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of people are probably investigating their own homes and, going to, places like cemeteries that are public that you can still visit. Here in Massachusetts, even though we're one of the hardest hit states, you can still pretty much go where you want to. It's just a lot of the stores are closed. So where do you go? The supermarkets are open and that kind of thing. But
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just pointing out. All I could see was the skull behind you, the sugar skull back there. I was like, what is that?
oh yeah,
But you're good.
Sorry.
Okay.
We're
I have my
fans.
phone in my hand and I'm charging it at the same time, so don't mind.
I've had to do Skype from my phone
Yes.
too.
It's they're tributes to the deceased, and I think that's a wonderful holiday that Mexico has. I think you mentioned something on a podcast about when you were doing paranormal investigations, doing residentials, and that kind of stuff. Before you got to the Stanley, you would often look at a person's DVD collection.
Yeah.
And things like sugar skulls. Like if you let me turn this around, I'll show you something. My daughter painted.
Yeah. That's pretty cool looking. Well, and then what does your shirt say? Does it say as above, so below?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's another telling point. By the way, did you know that's the name of the Euphomet episode that started Hellier?
Yes.
Yeah.
We did. We had
Nice.
just gotten that shirt. It was a whole synchronicity thing. We had just gotten that shirt, and then that's what it said, and we're like, no way. And then this whole stuff just like started happening. We're like, wow, with Tyler Strand, and it was just amazing. It really
Cool.
was. And then we started getting into it, and we were like, oh my God, they're just like us, down the rabbit holes, the things that you guys are experiencing. It's just amazing. So you're we were thinking of like George Meek and the SpiritCon press conference.
Mm-hmm. It's funny.
No, I saw that you posted it on your Facebook page. It's on YouTube. I watched it today. It was really great.
Yeah. More people don't know about that, which is funny. So ITC has its own sort of varied history, obviously, like we just sort of discussed. But one of the bigger devices was called the SpiritCom. George Meek and his colleague Bill O'Neill, George Meek was a respected inventor, claimed that they could communicate to this individual on the other side. His name was George Mueller. He was actually I believe, a Stanford professor while he was alive. So the deceased Mueller would communicate through this device to Bill O'Neill. What perks my skepticality of it, if that's a word, is that Bill O'Neill was the only person who could operate it. And when you look at the videos, what's funny, and so you watch this, people say all the time, like, how often do you guys probably hear this as well? Well, if somebody found proof of life after death, wouldn't they just tell the whole world about it and have a press conference? Well, that's exactly what George Meek tried to do, right? So he had called in members of the media, had a press conference, showed off the examples of the recordings. If they are real, they are really groundbreaking recordings, because he's directly communicating how to technically establish potential communication with the other side. I like to always sort of sit in terms of being more of a paranormal reporter sometimes, of being like, well, let's look at it from two sides. If you watch some of the videos too, and I encourage people to watch the videos of Bill O'Neill operating the SpiritCom. And I discussed this a little bit in my lecture too, where basically you will not hear him and Mueller talk at the same time, which sounds like you're getting into the finer details. But I also wonder, like, sometimes, like, well, wait, wouldn't they be interrupting each other, or something would be happening if it was an organic conversation that was happening for 2 hours? So that perks a little bit of the interest. Bill O'Neill, of course, maybe has his own controversies about him, but it's a fascinating watch.
It really is. I know we saw one part where Mr. O'Neill had left to go do something, and Mr. Oliver, and then he comes back and says what he was doing, but he teaches them basically how, or tells them how to make this SpiritCom box. So it's really very interesting, but I am skeptical like you. So
yeah, it's funny. It's and that's part of what I like about it, is that he just gave it all away. It wasn't. You have to be skeptical if somebody is trying to sell you something, per se, just like everything in life, And he was just sort of like, well, here's how we did it. Here you go. He had an enormous fortune. He actually, a lot of people don't realize this. He was one of the inventors of air conditioning, George Meek. And so we have him to thank for that. But then later in his life, he got so interested in these big questions, and that was one of the things he did regarding ITC, which is something you guys talk about quite often. So,
but I thought it was really interesting. I didn't realize George Meek had a fortune to himself and was doing this out of his own curiosity, and that gives him a little bit more credibility in this whole thing that I wasn't aware of. And I know a bit about the Spiritcom, and I find it really interesting. I love the recordings, that kind of zzz away,
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. And it's good to know. That's really interesting. It gives it a little bit more validity.
Mm-hmm. It's cool. And then also apparently Meek was sort of basically funding O'Neill in this research. He was put into contact with O'Neill through like a friend of a friend. And so it always goes back and forth, just like we keep talking throughout this discussion. It's like, well, was O'Neill just doing this so that he could keep having a job? Did he find a way to do something with his, we don't really have the answer, but what we do have are the schematics for the device. You can create a Spiritcom yourself. I mean, it's really not very difficult to, even if you just wanted to use the tones that they were using, all you have to do is Google just Spiritcom tones. There were 13 of them. They range around the hertz range of the male voice. And with the internet, what a beautiful thing. You could sit there on Google Chrome, open up 13 tabs to different frequency, sounds on YouTube or whatever, and just play all the tones at once, just like they did. And
what was the trigger, Connor? Well, this is the part I don't know. Like we were talking about the applications, and I my want for okay, I don't like the steady stream of banter and phonetics. I want to see something that triggers it I feel like it's more valid if there's some sort of external trigger. What was the trigger for the Spiritcom?
You're saying trigger in terms of a technical thing?
Well, what made the voices change? There had to be something.
Right. So what they did was they were actually basically, my understanding, running a microphone into a cassette deck tape recording and also simultaneously running in all of those 13 tones. And then playing back, landed on there, basically playing back in real time what that sort of was picking up in those terms.
All the tones were being pressed at one time?
So all the tones were on different, they actually had 13 speakers, boombox speakers.
Right. I'm trying to think old school. I haven't seen the equipment. I mean, it's pretty old school.
Cool. And it was just a wall of speakers, like a Guitar Center or something. And they're playing them all at once. And in theory, Mueller is taking these and creating a sort of voice around it. It sounds like one of those smoker things that people have, those larynx.
Sadly.
Oh my God, it sounds like that thing that they put to there, exactly like it.
Or maybe you're ordering a Big Mac or something like that.
Right. Yeah. So, like we were saying, they gave away their entire concoction. It was like we could build it again, or a modern day version of it. And I've experimented with the tones and have yet to catch anything myself, but I haven't sat and done it for hours and hours and hours like they did yet. So it's weird. It's a subject of a book. I think it's called The Ghost of 29 Megacycles, is the book that is about the Spiritcom specifically.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd love to read that, actually. I'm going to look that up.
Ghost of 29 spirit cycles?
Megacycles.
Megacycles.
Thank you.
I'll send you some of the actual manual that they created for the Spiritcom, so I can send you a PDF of that, or you can post it. I think it's available for free. I don't think we're taking any money from anybody from doing that, or at least a picture of what the tones were, because they released that, like I said.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much.
It's interesting because going back to what we were saying about tones in general, music and being played to you in some way or relayed to you in some way. We talked about megahertz or hertz, and hertz was originally the name, I believe, of the scientist that came up with the idea that of electromagnetic cycles were what created the tone.
So the cycles, hertz is the frequency of a sound wave, right? So everything vibrates. Everything around us vibrates, and the whole idea is the human ear can hear certain vibrations from 20 hertz up to 20,000 hertz. And that's actually a really big range. As you get
Right.
older, that starts to go down.
It starts to shrink, and it might change if you're male, female,
Right.
that kind of thing.
But the male voice will sit somewhere in like the 400 to 700 hertz range. Like we know the numbers. It's very easy you could do it with Audacity. It's a free program that's available. You can see what the frequency of the sounds are. And megahertz is, there are 1 million hertz in 1 megahertz, which is sort of difficult to wrap your mind around. So the FM station of 99.0 FM is 99 million hertz is what that is. That's beyond the range of human hearing by an enormous amount, obviously, but that's the radio frequencies.
Right. That's interesting. That's a great breakdown of that, because I think a lot of us, including myself, sometimes look at that kind of thing and go, huh?
Mm-hmm.
How much time do I have in my day?
Right. I understand.
So that's awesome. And so your radio is tuning to that. Mm-hmm. It's tuned to that, broadcasting on that band that's really outside of human hearing, but broadcasting a signal that we can understand.
Right. That's kind of the gist of how the radios work, which brings into its own question, and I don't have the answers. How does that relate to what we're doing in regards to ITC devices and spirit box devices sweeping through radio frequencies? It's very easy to say that it's DJs on the radio. I think oftentimes it is, giving these syllables. I think that people don't take seriously enough the idea of AM radios versus FM radios, so AM radios are doing something entirely, it's an entirely different broadband sort of like width of that frequency range. The FM radio is way beyond that. AM radios can travel extremely long distances. FM radios are a lot more condensed. And so you have to consider when you're making the decision on your settings on your spirit box, you got to know a little bit more about what's going on. It does.
You got to take into certainly the stations that are around you that, interfere with it. I remember trying to debunk with Kristen, in a location where, it was saying the same thing in a repetitive way, looking where on the dial that was happening. You know what I mean? Like, oh, that must be the radio station. And I slowed it down. I slowed the sweep rate down. Yeah. And it actually said the same thing, just slower, which was really freaking.
That is weird.
Yeah.
Well,
you've got to hear this. It's crazy. I think you would love this. It's insane. And that's our rabbit hole. It's crazy.
But that was AM band. An AM band does have a much larger range, as I understand, like you mentioned. We were able to replicate that, in different parts of Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. So geolocation-wise, it kind of didn't make sense because we had different stations, that would interfere, but we would get the same message.
So that's weird. And more of a rural area too. Obviously, the AM broadband width is going to be picked up more than the FM. But up at the Stanley, we would use AM, but we kind of went back and forth on different nights depending on what we were feeling, understanding that we're tuning into different things. AM is, I believe, measured in kilohertz, which is even more than FM. Or something like that. So I think there's 1,000 hertz in a kilohertz, and there's 1 million hertz in a megahertz, right? And so you start to understand these. It sounds very mathy, very numbery, and it is. But when we're using these devices, if we're able to actually pinpoint where spirit voices are coming from, that's a pretty big deal.
That's a huge thing. Like if you could narrow it down to a few frequencies, or, something like I think I mentioned earlier about the bats. I think that's called echolocation. Where they talk on a frequency of, our ears can't hear, and they talk back and forth, and there are programs and devices that can record them and then translate it down to the pitches that we can actually understand.
And how and people, so people in investigations though, like they're not doing that. So what, taking those frequencies and bringing them down, I don't know what exists beyond that. But
it sounds like, in a way, like the radio is kind of doing that for us in a certain way, right?
Right.
At least within a certain spectrum. Now,
Right.
our radios are all tuned to a certain spectrum. There are bands outside of that spectrum that we could be tuning into that we don't.
Yeah.
You know, the FCC regulates how this actually works, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and how noisy things can be and all that sort of stuff. What they're doing is all beyond. So the radio is way beyond, up above the human range of human hearing. The other interesting area is infrasound, which is below the human range of human hearing. Infrasound can create fear, can create people to feel really agitated.
We did a show of that,
Mhm.
and how it was in a movie theater, and people were coming. They used that sound,
Oh, cool.
through the big speakers, and people were coming out and throwing up.
That's a very real thing. That's
Yes.
what tigers do. That's
very scary.
those low growls. It will be below the range of human hearing. In addition, there's the sort of the fear qualification. They actually have pinpointed that down as well. You guys might have talked about this too. 19 hertz or 18. I think it's 18.98 specifically hertz is the frequency at which your eyeballs will vibrate. And so
Wow.
you will see things out of the corner of your eye when you're around that particular frequency. And it's because your eyeballs are vibrating inside of your skull.
So if a spirit were to vibrate in an attempt to communicate at that
Right.
megahertz, right, you might see spirit. You might see something.
Yeah.
Like a pat on the shoulder kind of thing.
Right. Or it's also a good explanation for places that aren't actually haunted that people think are. So
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Sure.
I don't know.
Like people measure EMF in their homes and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Weird how EMF is a now popular thing too. Yeah.
Do you think that EMF was kind of put out there because it was already manufactured?
Yeah. I think oftentimes EMF is explained because it's how many times, and you guys, like you said, do residential investigations. How many times do you go into somebody's basement? Well, that's the place where they feel the fear. Well, that's the place. Well, that's the place where the wiring for the home is right up above you, and you're in a dark, dingy space. It's creepy down there. Of course, your mind is going to be influenced by things like that. EMF is weird to me because I could see the argument going either way. So I don't really understand why we're going around sort of waving around EMF meters. Because if they're drawing power from things, then in my mind, wouldn't a downgrade in EMF be what we're looking for? But yet people get excited when there's a spike in EMF showing that there is energy present.
Right.
Well, it would have to go both ways. So you get into these little mental traps.
In my best interactions, I had a millimeter that had the REM pod attachment to it, right?
Yeah.
So the thing was measuring temperature, it was measuring EMF, of course, because that's what they are. Yeah. And it was doing the REM thing with its antenna, like a REM pod.
Okay.
And they all went ballistic when it was truly touched. And I have a video of it, and it almost seemed to play music, and it was crazy. I actually sent it to Gary Galga, the guy that makes those things.
Yeah.
And he came back and he couldn't explain why all those sensors would get triggered. Like, it would be really hard to recreate that. I made a video. No, barely has any views because people probably just think it's BS. They just see the thing going nuts. Yeah. But if you watch the thing closely, you will see all the sensors go wild. So it is my feeling that, yes, it was touched by spirit. And when that happens, it's almost like, it doesn't matter what the energy is at that point. It can do what it wants to do. And that's why I go back to the thing about the divining rods and that kind of stuff. It's like, if it wants to communicate, it almost doesn't matter what you got and what your tools are. It will communicate. It depends on that connection. Whether or not we build that connection or it builds that connection or it's some kind of combination. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't know. There's a lot of questions there. I can't do it all the time. Right. You know what I mean? But when it happens, it is pure magic, man. It's like, wow, you just sit there and go.
And that's why it is paranormal. That's why it is. Yeah. And it's the perfect formula. I'm not sure will ever necessarily be concocted. Because then what's the point in belief in terms of these things, stuff like that. So yeah, in that case, that's a larger question. I like that idea of sort of, I think I might agree with you in terms of the bridges. There must be a bridge between people who are present, between them and the spirit, between their intentions, things like that. And that's something that the Newkirks really sort of compounded in my mind as well. And you can see in Hellier, we're doing these very clear intention settings where, before you start doing something, they will sit down and they'll be like, and it sounds, and I'm, as you could probably tell, a little bit more of a technicality kind of person.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but they sit there and it's so cool where they're sitting there like, all right, now take off your shoes, and we're just going to sort of all relax as one, and we're going to imagine the word of contact, and we're going to put it out there into the universe, and then we're going to go on about our night. It's about setting that intention early on, making that call out. It doesn't have to be a big, complicated thing. And I think that's kind of a beautiful idea.
Yeah,
I think that's
the
awesome.
intention is a lot of it, and it's a lot of magic and the occult. Essentially, come down to intention. The idea that you would cast a spell, you're really putting your intention out into the universe, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So if you want to communicate with the dead, which is usually called necromancy, and those fields, you would want to set out your intention. So that makes total sense, really.
Yeah, and that's the same with prayer as well. That's
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. Goes both ways.
Yeah. If we're talking about electronic ITC, there's a whole lot there that I think a lot of television tropes unnecessarily have sort of like compounded, that like, this is how you do an EVP session. This is how you do this. When you could do things very differently. You could do things in your basement. You could do things sitting there playing with these frequencies, playing with these different ideas that are out there available to consume in books, in different articles. There's an interesting section of people. There's something that I'd also recommend viewing is a documentary called Calling Earth, which is I think on Vimeo, and it was basically about this guy named Mark Macy. And it's so weird that there's a community of ITC people who are not involved in quote unquote the paranormal. They're not necessarily ghost hunting, but it's actually a group of people who are like attempting communication with their deceased children. I mean, like an incredibly more personalized, like
heartfelt for sure.
Yeah,
Wow.
Which is so weird that there's the same topic, but this sort of like dichotomy around it, where it's like
that's kind of wasn't it the theme of White Noise, that old movie?
Oh,
more
no,
or less.
I haven't seen.
I think it was his wife that passed or something. Yeah, maybe
personalized.
Yeah, and one of the things they actually I wanted to ask you, so I'm glad that came up, was have you experimented with video ITC?
Yeah, because this is our experiment soon.
That's cool. That's very cool. Well, I won't steal your thunder, but I know exactly what you're talking about. People have used one of the coolest images I'm sure you've probably seen is an apparent image of Friedrich Jurgensen, one of the old guys, right, of ITC appearing through a television screen where they intentionally mess up those figures. So visual ITC has not been a realm that I've dove into yet.
It seems tedious, but like the results are really cool. I've seen, I think from that same person, they had a prince or something like come through, and it was you can easily Google a picture of that ITC versus like a painting of the guy. Yeah, and it looks like the same person,
which is cool.
That's cool.
Yeah,
but you got to go frame by frame. Apparently,
right.
Figure this out. Right. Like it's in one frame,
which is nuts because you're in addition. That's like taking an audio file and going, bit by bit in terms of just milliseconds. So you don't get the entire picture. It's not a whole sentence because that would be displayed amongst an entire whole thing. But video ITC would be a lot of fun. What's weird, and just kind of what I was discussing, there's this whole ridiculousness. There's a lot of YouTube channels. There's a lot of, and I won't like name any names, but they're all just doing some really ridiculous stuff, possibly faking stuff, possibly this. And then there's other people who are doing it extremely earnestly and quietly, who are doing it with old answering machines, who are doing it with things like that. And where do you sit? You got to
Panasonic DR60 that goes for $2,000 on eBay.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Panasonic DR60.
How do you feel about that? I feel like it's a little ridiculous. I like the clarity of, modern technology and stereo recording and, really a wide range. But at the same time, I can't deny that some of the results of the DR60 are intriguing.
I lean a little bit more towards your end on there. What's funny is Greg has a DR60, so I've seen it in action before, and we've played with it. But the thing is the recorder's a really bad recorder. Nobody's arguing about that. You look at the frequency response, it's hardly even picking up all of the human voice. I mean, it's a really old, bad recorder. Is it the perfect concoction to pick up voices? Possibly. I think it's more likely a device that you can have a lot of pareidolia from. But what I think is interesting about it, and what that brings into question, is audio recorders, handheld audio recorders. If you find the right amount, like I have a recorder that I have is one of my favorites. It's like a Sony VNPC something, and it's just this old little tiny one, and that's just become something I've known. Do people get a connection with their device? How weird is that?
Right.
Is that possible?
That gets us back to the applications, right? And people like constantly on their phones. So could there be some legitimacy there because they're putting all that intent and energy into their phones?
Yeah.
You wonder. I've heard those things work, and my own mind goes, "Oh no, spares can't figure that out. Like, how are they going to figure that out?" But how do they figure out, an AM radio? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, but they can figure it out, right? So the data shows.
You toss and turn to the same questions at nighttime, like a lot of people do. Another thing is cassette recorders. I have one. People won't be able to see this like you guys can, but I've been using just a standard cassette recorder.
Oh, yeah.
And what's cool about it is, like I said, when you catch something on a cassette recording, and this was encouraged to me by Tenny as well, it's AVP, it's not EVP. That's analog voice phenomena, which brings into its own set of questions. So the way a cassette recorder works, basically, is my understanding, it's got a line, like sort of a line of an assembly line, and it's organizing all of these little tiny bits of, I want to say magnetite off the top of my head. These little tiny magnets are aligning in a perfect way so that it records what it is hearing in the sound around it. It's an actual physical thing. So if you caught an EVP on a cassette, you could cut it out and say, here's the EVP. I'm holding it physically in my hands. That's entirely different than catching something electronically, right? Because it's not a physical thing. So how weird is it? And it brings into question again, do spirits have the ability to change around those little tape, those little magnets, those little dots on the tape? It seems that they do, if you look at the ideas of Radava. And other people are trying experiments. One of the things that Tenny also expressed to me is try sleeping with cassettes underneath your pillow at night, see what happens. Who knows what could be picked up, but it's fun.
And that's really interesting. And like the point I mentioned about the millimeter with the 3 different things that it had, it's readouts, it's sensors. When Spirit touches it, it really wasn't EMF. I mean, it said it was like 500 degrees in my bedroom. So how does that make sense? It doesn't make any sense, right? It's just hitting it with a jolt of whatever it can do. So the idea that it could manipulate a cassette tape and the way a magnetic dust falls isn't really out of scope. It's more the intent, and proving it. There's a lot of fakers out there. There's a lot of fakers in this field of ITC in particular, and we were on Midnight Society, which is kind of like it's a new show out there.
Is that with Tim Weisberg? Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Tim is awesome.
Yeah, I know Tim. Yeah.
And we were talking about that, and we got into a certain gentleman's name that rhymes with cream puff, more or less, who's been debunked and shown to be a phony, which really sucks because
I've never heard
you can
easily
stuff with Audacity. I mean, you could absolutely throw anything you wanted in with white noise, and
Yeah.
Apparently this gentleman has used interviews and clips of interviews in his supposed recordings and stuff, and it makes us all look bad. When you were sitting here trying to earnestly
Terrible.
do it the right way, trying to cross that bridge.
And
Right.
yet he's still doing it. And he's such a
Yeah.
fraud. And it just makes us all look
It pisses us all off. Tim really gets
horrible.
upset.
Tim, he really gets
Really,
under Tim's skin.
I've heard
Just-
it go
He's
off.
not shit. But he's right. And
Okay.
I feel the same way. I do feel passionately about what we do. I want to
Love ITC
go
stuff.
through all the
We love
steps to
experimenting.
present it in what it is, and it's real.
Mhm.
This is what we experienced.
Right.
You can believe it. You don't have to believe it. It's just data. You know what I mean? It's
That's
there. Take it
evidence,
as it is.
data.
Like you guys often say, take it to the next level, right? Here's the data. Move on with it. If you hear something, I'll put things out on SoundCloud. We have a SoundCloud channel.
Cool.
And just put it out in its wave format and just, here.
Yeah, you crowdsource your work, I don't know why there needs to be secrets necessarily. I mean, there are that comes, I guess, with a caveat. There are like individuals that we will sort of block out their identity, obviously, but that's because it's really sort of sensitive things. And people are nuts. I mean, some of the messages that you get, looking in there, sometimes you get a little bit more trepidatious. But in terms of the paranormal research, put it out there. You guys have sort of an undisclosed location, like you were talking about, but you're catching things and willing to put them out there. That's what makes the difference.
Right. I hope that doesn't,
Right.
make us look too bad. But in respect to the actual location, we do it that way.
Mhm.
We tell people. Most people can figure it out. We leave a lot of clues.
Yeah.
And put up as part of their sign about the rules, no paranormal investigations. It literally says that. So out of respect to them, we call it the undisclosed location.
At any rate, I hope that to the people who listen to you guys, we got the fun with it and to experiment with different, it's fun to experiment with different technological capabilities because like even in our hands, in our recordings, we have a lot of really cool things that can be caught. So, and that's kind of I guess we didn't discuss necessarily so much Hellier, but that's kind of what it is. It's just like get out there with your friends and look into some really weird stuff.
Now, where can people find you, Connor?
Yeah, people can find me. It's at Connor J Randall. I'm on Twitter, Instagram. I have a Facebook page, Connor James Randall Paranormal, and then also Hellier is available on Amazon Prime and also on YouTube. So available for viewing. I do my best to just sit and answer questions, and I like talking about strange stuff with people. So if I'm available, I will be around. I appreciate you guys.
Right on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're welcome. Go take care of those dogs now.
I will. Bye, Kristen. We'll see you.
Bye,
Thank you.
Connor.
Have a great night.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Dark Horse Paranormal Podcast.
Please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to this. You can find us on almost all social media.
Especially www.darkhorseparanormal.com to stay up to date on coming podcasts, our Bigfoot and the Bunny schedule, and we're going to be adding live streams soon. So stay tuned. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
I would like to dedicate this show to our cat that we lost tragically. His name is Freddie. Tristus Magistus, Mr. Biscuits, Kitty Biscuits,
Mommy's MacGuffin.
Mommy's MacGuffins. We love him dearly, and he lives on in our hearts. And
We
we miss him.